Right, so let's get started. Welcome to our session on how to build an individual giving program at a hospital charity. And I'm delighted to introduce Paul White, who's the head of donor care, which is basically the head of individual giving, I think, Addenbrooke's Charitable Trust, which is the charity for Addenbrooke's Hospital in Cambridge. And ChangeStar has worked with Paul for many years, from his time at the conservation charity Fauna and Flora International, and most recently helping him and his team at ACT with their strategy and creative work since he joined. I think it is around September 2018, isn't it, Paul?
Yeah, it was. Yeah. 3 years and counting. Who'd have thought it? Eh?
Goodness. Anyway, well, welcome. Good to have you here. Maybe we could start with just sort of start at the start. You know, where was ACT with its individual giving work at the point that you and we, in fact, sort of got involved with it about 3 years ago?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. Where to start? Where was it? Yeah, it's interesting. I think, I mean, in a sense, looking back now, I think the kind of job title was quite telling as to where ACT was with its individual giving program. They didn't call it individuals giving; it called it donor care, and it within donor care was everything basically. It was a kind of a real plethora of different activities, tactics, fundraising activities, all sorts of things in there. We had raffles, lotteries, some appeals, some newsletters. There really was a lot in there. And but what was interesting was that it was clear quite quickly that the elements of a good individual giving program were in there, and there were some really good activities that were kind of showing some real kind of potential quite early on. I think almost a challenge for us at the time was to see through everything that we were doing and to focus in on, okay, what are the things that we need to almost kind of bring it back, take a step back and think, do we need to be doing absolutely every type of fundraising there is under the sun, or do we need to really kind of focus on the things that we can grow in order to be kind of sustainable? What are the pieces of information and data we can start looking at to really make informed decisions about those activities that are generating real returns? And part of that was about looking beyond 12 months, because I think we probably all work charities where there's a habit of looking at the return on investment of a very specific activity, whereas actually what we really want to do with individuals giving programs is actually look at how does this transform the fortunes of the charity over a much longer period of time. And some of those activities that we were doing had a bigger impact on that than others, so that helped to drive some of our decisions there. So like I said, so it had an individuals giving program. It was just needed recognizing that that's what it was, and needed trimming and tidying at the edges, shall we say.
So it needed sort of a proper focus behind it, really, on that, and on prioritizing some of the activities and their work. So what did you identify as some of the kind of key priorities for individual giving when you arrived?
Well, I mean, the very first priority was to actually ask some people for some money. So it had been quite some time since the organisation had done an appeal. So our very first priority was get a Christmas appeal out the door. And one of the things I did was we mailed far more people than the organisation would normally have felt comfortable mailing with that appeal. So quite a few segments of the database that had previously been either kept aside for other activities or not contacted for various sensible reasons. So we just wanted to get a bit of data about what those people would actually do if we contacted them. But I think whenever I go into a charity and start thinking about the individual giving program, the first thing that's always on my mind is regular giving, direct debits. Do you have people that are giving you flexible, unrestricted money on a very regular basis? Because generally speaking, they're the kind of foundation piece of a regular giving program.
Yeah.
An individual giving program, sorry. Because they're very committed, and they do a really good indicator of the health of an individual's giving program. Now we were really fortunate, or I was really fortunate when we joined ACT, because there was a program called the Friends that was already up and running. But so what we've been doing over the couple of years is to kind of move the Friends from being one of many activities that we do to being the very bedrock of what we do. So it's the default ask when we acquire new supporters, or when we're looking to kind of convert leads. It's the kind of, our aim is to get all of as many people as possible onto a regular gift.
Yeah.
No, there's lots of benefits to doing that. You know, it's good monthly unrestricted cash flow, but what we've seen through the analysis of the data of lots of other activities is that the direct debit givers, the people that are given on a monthly basis, contrary to some logic, are your most responsive supporters to other asks that you put in front of them. So despite the fact they're already giving you lots and lots of money every single month, they're significantly more likely to give you a cash gift if you then send them something in the post, or significantly more likely to express an interest in legacies. So they really are, you know, once you've got somebody under that regular gift, you know you've got that commitment. You turn them from that ad hoc, quite fragile supporter into something that's very committed, part of your kind of conversation and your family. So
it's very
that was really the priority for us.
So it's very much the idea as well of really focusing on that and making that the core way of supporting the charity, isn't it? It's sort of clearing out all the detritus of other possible ways you can support, and saying, look, if you want to support us, this is the most effective way.
Yeah, absolutely. And that did involve a few challenging internal kind of discussions and decisions to be made, because like I say, there were quite a few activities that we were doing, and all of them were making a good profit, so none of them were kind of bad activities to be doing. But you know, the example we often use when we talk about this is the contrast between people that are giving a monthly direct debit, so our friends of Addenbrooke's, and our lottery players. So lottery is in effect another regular giving product. The difference is what we found was it was really difficult to get lottery players to substantially do other things for the charity, whereas with our direct debit givers, they were really easy to get them to take other forms of commitment. And almost once they've taken that step of signing up for a direct debit, getting them to then consider cash gifts to appeals or legacy inquiries or whatever it might be, even coming to events, was far more likely. So we kind of intentionally slowed down what we were doing with lottery and increased the investment in direct debit.
Right.
And it was the right thing to do. So we've sort of more than doubled the number of people that we have giving by monthly direct debit each month since we joined. That's had a really big impact on lots of other activities, but like I said, on that kind of flexible monthly cash flow for the organisation as well.
So it's that sort of rebalancing of activities and just trying to focus down on what really is bringing in the income.
Yeah, it's a real challenge for lots of charities, is that there are a gazillion and one different ways that we could be raising money from our communities. And almost a challenge that charities have, particularly charities that are relatively early in their development or their growth, is to focus on the things that will make a difference and not try to do a bit of absolutely everything, and not be distracted by the kind of potentially shiny opportunities. And some of these are really difficult conversations, difficult decisions to be made, because it's so easy to think, oh no, there's this really big event, we better be part of that. And actually, when you start kind of doing the maths, they're not necessarily the right things to do. They're the sorts of things you can really enjoy doing once you've really got the program developed and mature. And and
it can be hard, I think, when you've also got pressure from internally, from perhaps senior management teams who like the shiny stuff as well. They may not be as informed as you are about the stats and what the most effective activities are. So they may be going, oh, we could run an event, that would be amazing. Well, no, hang on. So yeah, I think really, for me, the sort of the art of good individual giving is sometimes the art of doing the boring things well. You know, actually, this sounds a terrible thing to tell people on a fundraising call, but actually it is a bit about discipline and about sticking to the things that do work and not getting distracted by shiny things too much.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, you know, one of the really important things with individual giving is to be really clear on what you're measuring and what you're reporting on, because lots of the activities that we might do, on the face of it, you might think, oh wow, fantastic, this enormous great marathon run event, you know, on the face of it looks far more successful because you've got whatever 2,000 people lacing up their trainers for you on any particular day. So being really clear about what you're measuring, and that's where the long-term value really comes in, really helps to tell the true and proper picture of the value of an activity. And we'll come on to things like door dropping results of such, you know, acquisition activities, and how you can present two different pictures of how those are performed. But yeah, knowing what you're measuring is really important. I think one of the great assets that so many charities overlook is the value of the data they hold. You know, we hold tens of thousands of individual pieces of data, you know, thousands of supporters, and each supporter has thousands of bits of information on their record. So knowing what piece of information will give you an idea about how healthy your program is. So is the database growing in terms of number of people you can generally contact? Are the number of transactions, number of second gifts growing? Those sorts of things that really give you an underlying idea of the health of the kind of fundraising program.
I think that's a good point, yeah. And I think a couple of the things that I saw when we came in as well at that early point of some of the priorities, I think you're absolutely right, was about sort of getting the balance right and focusing on priorities. I think for me, some of the priorities were, and it always are, look at the supporter development program first before you start attacking the recruitment side of things. Look at the supporter development program and make sure that that is optimized, that that is doing its job properly, and that you actually have a proper supporter journey for anybody who's being recruited into the charity. Because otherwise, if you spend lots of money on recruitment, then you're going to be wasting that money effectively by not having a proper sort of follow-up to people and not be able to maximize their value. So I think that was the important thing. And then I think following on from that with the with recruitment, when you get round to recruitment, was about how can we make the best of the people that are already in contact with the charity. And for me, one of the amazing things about hospital charities, one of the great opportunities, is that your target audience is actually coming to you. You know, a lot of the certainly before COVID it was anyway, but you know, there's the footfall around the hospital. There are corridors, there are patients, there are families, and there are the hospital has a lot of contact with the local community already. And it's about how do you optimize those touch points that the hospital already has to improve its fundraising, because I think that then you don't need to spend lots of extra money on finding those people, which is what a lot of charities have to spend the most of their money on, is about, you know, finding those names that might support them.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's a kind of, if we look back to the kind of very, you know, I mean, hopefully lots of us are familiar with your classic kind of donor pyramid, where, you know, the very bottom of your pyramid are the mass of people that might only be vaguely aware of who you are. And as you move up the pyramid, you know, the smaller the audience, but the greater the commitment they give. But, you know, the truism in that is that someone will only give you a donation if they know who you are. And the more they know who you are, and the more they trust you, the more likely they are to make a donation or make a commitment. So focusing on those people that already have a relationship with you, already aware of who you are, already have a sense of kind of trust and gratitude, you're going to get far greater response rate than if you go to people who've got absolutely no idea who you are, and you've already got that challenge of trying to explain to them first, well, this is who we are and this is what we do.
And clearly now, you know, the last year or two has been the time when people have been so grateful towards the NHS and so aware of the work that their hospitals do, and there's still time to galvanize people behind that. You know, it's like the opportunity hasn't gone. It's still very much there for all hospitals, and so now is a really good time if you're going to be starting individual giving or getting into it to actually be doing that. So this is a really good time to have this conversation, I think.
Yeah, that's a really good point, Richard, because I think you'll probably remember that, you know, one of the things that we talked about when we first started working together with ACT was that almost hospital charities were a number of years behind the wider charitable sector, in that there was still work to be done in order to get people to think of giving to their local hospital as normal, in the same way that we think nothing of giving to British Red Cross if there's a disaster, or, you know, nothing about giving to you know, an environmental charity if we see an insert in a newspaper or something. Where almost it still wasn't entirely normal giving to your kind of local hospital. And we, you know, we'll where the kind of challenges of why that might be, but then almost the pandemic came along and, you know, matured all of that. It, you know, it achieved in a very short period of time what would have taken many years to achieve before, which is it became not only normal to give to hospital, it became the only thing that many people considered doing during, you know, 2020. And yeah, I think Richard's right, that hasn't gone away, and we're still seeing results that indicate that propensity to give is still much higher than we would normally have expected.
So before we start talking about some of the individual activities that you did and we put together, I wonder if we could just ask a little bit more about the preparatory stage, and maybe that's still going on, is just how do you get the senior management team behind your plans? Because I think this is something that is a challenge probably for a lot of fundraisers, is that, you know, that they know roughly what they need to do to build this sort of plan, but actually getting backing for it and getting enough investment and commitment from the organization and understanding of it, that can often be the real challenge. How did you go about doing that, or is that still an ongoing thing that you're doing?
Yeah, I mean, I would say it's still an ongoing thing. You know, we still have those conversations with our senior management, with our trustees. We still go through a process of getting buy-in for new activities, you know, selling the concept of a new activity or a new channel or a new approach with them. Although the conversations we're having now are entirely different to the conversations we were having 3 years ago. You know, so one of the first things, we did was to write a very brief individuals giving strategies. We said, oh, this is the intention. So rather than talking about, you know, doing less, focusing on these things, we created a strategy that said, look, we're going to grow the size of the database. We're going to grow the value of those people to the organisation. And what we're going to do is we're going to measure it and demonstrate how taking that approach benefits not only an individual giving program, which will become very profitable in its own right, but you'll start to see knock-on impacts on your legacy fundraising program, your community fundraising program, even your major gifts programs. You start to develop those people on the database into kind of greater forms of commitment. And we started setting some targets and using some of the data that we already had in the database to back those targets up. So when we're speaking to the trustee, we say it's not just about spending £20,000 delivering a cash appeal that we think is going to raise 50, 60, 70,000 pounds. It's about a broader programme that will raise X amount of money over the lifetime of those supporters. So I think probably one of the first pieces of kind of data analysis I did was to work out what our lifetime value is. So what we mean by lifetime value is what's the net profit we expect to raise from a retained supporter over the next 10 years. Now that's probably one of the most important calculations you can possibly work out. So for us, it worked out at about £1,250, to round it to the nearest pound. Now what that meant was we were able to have, instead of saying we want to spend £20,000 on a piece of recruitment activity that might add, I don't know, 200 names to your database, which on the face of it sounds very expensive. So you can understand why a trustee or a senior management might look at that and go, there's a lot we could do with £20,000. That doesn't look like a brilliant return. But when you start talking about the lifetime value, you know, you add 100 names to the database, and those 100 names times 1,250 suddenly becomes a very compelling amount of money. So, you know, if you add 400 names to the database, you're talking, you know, approaching £500,000 worth of profit over the next 10 years. So suddenly that begins to make sense, and people think, oh, okay, I get that. So that was a really important part of it. There's always an element of trust in there when it comes to
because I was going to say it's also, you know, that you've got to, I think that's a very good point, you've got to make the long term, to show the long term value of this stuff, because that's what you're there for. But also I think the trustees and the senior people at the organisation have to understand that this is a long-term game, individual giving. It's not something that will necessarily bring instant results, even though some cash appeals might do well. You know, they have to be in it for the long term. They have to be willing to invest in it for the long term, because that's where the real value comes from.
Absolutely. And it's not just about doing, you know, one piece of individual giving activity each year and calling that a program. It's about doing actually what amounts to quite a lot of activity over the course of the year, you know, mailing our supporters many more times than we might have otherwise done so, mailing people that, as I mentioned earlier, might previously have been overlooked for some of these activities. So and also we took a very different approach to the style of the ask that we're making. So they were much more upfront, much bolder, much more emotive. So, you know, that it's easy to see that would feel a kind of shock to the system, a little bit uncomfortable for some people, particularly, you know, trustees who, you know, this is so far removed from what they're used to, and such a kind of different form of fundraising to what some of them might be comfortable with. But they, you know, they're very comfortable with reactive types of fundraising. So somebody walked through the door and say, I'm so grateful for the treatment, I want to do a bake sale for you. Incredibly, sort of risk-free part of fundraising. But mailing 400,000 cold contacts and saying, here's this incredibly emotional story, sign up to a direct debit, it was a bit of a kind of culture shock.
But I think that leads to another really important point, is that it's about building that trust, isn't it? And that really, I think you can only do that through showing proof of your ideas in practice. So you get people incrementally more on side each time you do an appeal and your ideas work, and it brings in the results, and they go, okay, well, maybe there's something in this. And then each time it happens and each time it does well, they're more and more on side and become more bold and more committed to your vision of how it should work.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So we try to be really consistent about the things that we said from the outset that we would measure, and then report back to our senior management and our trustees on those things. So response rate, so percentages of the people that we mailed that actually responded, average gift values, conversion to second gift, proportion of the database that's giving by monthly direct debit. We took a handful of relatively easy to measure statistics. We said generally show the health of the individual giving program. We said we're going to keep reporting back to you to demonstrate that these things are growing. And fortunately, we've been able to do that. So every time we do an activity, we update our reports and we send them back to senior management and trustees to say, look, this is how we've moved the dial on each of these different KPIs that we set from the beginning that we would kind of hold ourselves accountable to. Now, certain circumstances have played into our hands here, so we have been quite fortunate. But one of the really nice graphs that I like showing is that every time we do a cash appeal, the results outperform the last cash appeal, and that's been really consistent since day one. So, we said from the outset that the more we do these activities, the more successful we can make them, because we learn more about the way that our supporters respond. We can become much more sophisticated about the way that we break down the segments, the way that we speak to them, the language we use. So you'd expect the results over time to increase. We didn't expect them to increase quite as consistently as they have done, but being able to show that 3 years on, we've gone from appeals that raise 15,000 to appeals that raise 80, 90,000 a time, and that those results are really quite predictable and consistent, just means that they feel like they're taking less of a risk each time they say yes to one of these activities.
Well, we'll talk about some of the results in a minute, and people watching this will be pleased to know that we're actually going to share some results with you, which is a rarity in these situations. We're actually going to talk about some results. So before we get on to the supporter development stuff, I thought it would be good just to talk about how so far you've gone about recruiting new supporters for this, and maybe what's worked and what hasn't. And maybe I could just sort of set the ground on a strategic level here, in that, as I was saying earlier, the first thing that we would always suggest, particularly for hospitals, but for any charity, if we're all going to try and recruit new supporters, it's better to look at the people that are closest to you first. So to do what we would call a touch point review. So to stand back and look at every single point at which the organisation, your charity, has contact with the public. So for a hospital charity, that might be through the people coming into the hospital, so footfall within the corridors and the entrance areas of the hospital, the actual hospital site. It could be patients in the hospital and and maybe sort of outpatient mailings that they receive. It could be through social media, it could be your website, to make a list of all of those sorts of touch points, and then work out, well, how many unique people do you have contact with throughout the year? And try and sort of just prioritize those to say, well, which are the ones that you could really make the most of for fundraising? Which are the ones that are likely to have the most impact? And then on each one, pick each one off and analyze it. Look at what are the opportunities for raising money from it. And I think this process, we'd started this process with ACT, but I think COVID got in the way. So what we actually ended up doing is actually then going to some paid activity as well as that, in order to try and do some fundraising and capitalize on what the situation that was happening a year or two ago. So I think maybe the first thing we should look at, Paul, is a couple of the things that you've done with existing touch points, and then we can talk about some of the external recruitment we've done. The one thing I would just say to anybody who's watching this as well is that the subject of our next Friday fundraising call in the new year is actually about how to put together a touch point review. We've got someone who's done that and we've worked together with. So do sign up for that one, because you'll get a lot more detail in that. So Paul, what are a couple of the things then that you've done in terms of the existing touch points within around the hospital?
Yeah, so our first priority was to make sure that we were very visible in the hospital. I think it was easy to, for anyone that knows Addenbrooke, it's an enormous hospital. It's a really confusing, busy place on the best of days, even when there are no patients or visitors there. So it's easy to lose the charity marketing within there. So one of the things that we looked to do, which we worked with our comms team on, was to make sure that we were incredibly visible. It was really difficult not to realise that the hospital has its own charity. So we initially created some very bright yellow hubs, which sit in the kind of main entrance areas to the main points of the hospital. And for anyone that's been into the hospital, they're very yellow. It was that was a getting the hospital on board with bright yellow fundraising hubs in a hospital that's kind of predominantly blue branding was interesting. But the point is they cut through all the noise, so they're really obvious. And we put within there things like coin drops and contactless donation points. And that's going to sound right an odd thing to say. We didn't actually put those things in because we expected them to make money. What we put those things in was to make people realise that they could give a donation. As it happens, they make a reasonable amount of money. And then we also put leaflet holders in, which gave people the opportunities to take certain targeted leaflets about legacies or cash donations or friends. That was our kind of biggest priority, because it meant that at least we had a fighting chance of the million people that come through the hospital each year to see the charity. As Richard says, COVID kind of got in the way of us fully exploring and deploying all of the different touch points that we'd begun to talk about.
Past patient mailings were something that you'd been looking at.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And the charity and the hospital had a history of doing past patient mailings, and they'd been very successful in the past. Then GDPR came along, and the whole thing got paused for a bit whilst we worked through the activity with the hospital to find out whether or not it was still we still felt comfortable doing it. We could find a compliant way of justifying and carrying out the activities.
And sorry to interrupt, Paul, could we just explain to everybody what we mean by past patient mailings?
Yeah, of course. Yeah, so past patient mailing essentially is that we work with the hospital to identify a group of patients. It might be anybody that's been through oncology in the last 3 years, or it might be parents or guardians of children who've been through children's services in the last year. A discrete group of patients that we can kind of define. We then design a pack that doesn't ask for money, just asks for consent for that, ask for that person to consent to the charity contacts them. That letter is sent out by the hospital. So it's a hospital mailing. We never see the data. All we do is design the collateral around it. The hospital arranges for it to be mailed to those patients, and then when people respond saying absolutely entirely happy for the charity to contact me, those are the responses that come back to the charity. So it's lead generation. So then we get the opportunity to convert those leads into fully fledged supporters.
Right.
And our primary ask for those people is to follow up very quickly once we've got their consent, where they join the Friends of Addenbrooke's ask.
Right. So and that, I mean, I think to summarize that's been a bit of a learning process in itself, hasn't it, really, about sort of getting the hospital on board with that process?
Yeah, it's really interesting. So the kind of information management and patient experience teams in the hospital are really on board with it. Where we've found challenge, and I say we have delivered a few of these over the last 2 or 3 years, and they're really successful. The response rates are fantastic. Anywhere between 5 and 10% of the people we mail will respond back saying absolutely, you can, the charity can send me its marketing. So as far as lead acquisition goes, they're kind of unusually high response rates, but then it's a really warm audience. So you'd expect them to be more inclined to say, yeah, I'm happy for the charity to contact me. Where we've found some challenges, that some departments are more familiar with their patient data than other departments. So where a department is really hot on their use of EPIC, which is the hospital's database, it's very easy to define who those patients are and get a mailing out. Other departments, it's more of a challenge, we say. But you know, each one we do, we learn from, and it gets slightly easier each time. So we've got plans to expand that past patient mailing program, so we can try and mail as many of the patients in the hospital as possible, because you know, there's a million potential there, although I don't think we'll ever get to mailing a million.
But there's, as you say, the potential for that is absolutely huge. And I think for anybody from other hospitals that's part of this and watching, is that, you know, that it's not always the easiest thing to get agreement on, but if you can sort of start the conversation and push it on gently, I think it was in the way that ACT have, you may be able to start testing it and just seeing what works. But
Yeah,
you know, that is a potential source of not just being able to sort of get the names, but then obviously you put them onto a conversion program to get them onto your direct debit, to get them onto direct debit, which can be incredibly effective, because again, these are people that are grateful that the hospital has helped them.
Yeah, and we found that once we convert those leads to supporters, either cash or direct debit supporters, they are unusually responsive to other things that you do with them. So they're really good value contacts to get on the database. Interestingly, one of the things that's really helped to reassure the hospital with regard to past patient mailings is because one of their worries, quite legitimately, was how would it be perceived if the hospital was asking permission to give a patient's data to a charity, which is in effect an independent charity. And you know, would we get lots of complaints? So you know, we as well as asking for people's consent, we also include an opportunity for that person to write a nice story, or potentially any feedback they want to give. And overwhelmingly, I mean, it's something like 90% of the people that return those forms also fill in their story on the back, and overwhelmingly positive comments that come back. So people really expressing their gratitude to the hospital, to particular clinicians or surgeons or nurses, members of staff. You know, the hospital being able to see, you know, hundreds or thousands of people sending back nice messages, reassures them that it's you know, the public are okay with it.
Yeah,
you know,
absolutely.
We get a couple of people that say, "Oh, can you reassure me that my data hasn't been sold to a charity?" But we get the opportunity to then go back and say, "No, absolutely not. The charity has never and will never see your data unless you consent to it." So we've got all of those kind of questions and responses lined up, and we're very comfortable with it. But like I say, the results are so overwhelmingly positive that it's again a different conversation we have with the hospital now. It's what we might have had, you know, 3 years ago.
So I think that's a really good couple of examples of, you know, how a hospital charity can start making the most of the people that are already sort of in touch points around it. I think perhaps one of the next things, one of the next stages for Addenbrooke is to look at those touch points around the hospital, like in corridors, things like that, where there are posters at the moment, and then start to really build on that with this kind of coherent, regular giving ask, and to say, right, this is the way to give to us. You know, forget about some of those other ways. You know, the regular giving ask is the way to support the charity. But there are so many beautiful opportunities to do that, of maybe having fundraising hubs, you know, maybe having volunteers that can actually sign people up in the high footfall areas and be able to offer them incentives, for example, to get involved. There's real potential for that in a lot of charities and a lot of hospitals, I think. So yeah, that's something for the future. But perhaps we could now move on to the sort of paid recruitment, because I think when COVID happened, that shut down, obviously, hospitals and a lot of opportunities for fundraising within the hospitals. At the same time, it put on ridiculous amount of pressure onto hospitals, and you know, it sort of really heightened the way that the public felt about hospitals. So I think we got to that point where you felt it was the right time to do some external fundraising, and we chose to do door drops in the local area. And perhaps we could say a little bit about this. And I'm sorry, everybody, that we might not be able to speak about this in a lot of detail, because we've only got about 20 minutes left, and we've got to talk about supported development as well. But perhaps we could just have a quick go at that, Paul. And at the same time, I can show an example of the door drop pack while you're talking.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So we knew there was increased propensity towards the NHS and hospital charities. So we really wanted to kind of capitalise that. And the database was already growing as a result of the pandemic. But we thought, you know, what's the opportunity? We've got acquisition spend that we haven't been able to use because you know, the hospital has effectively closed its doors to the public. So what's the next best thing we can do? So I had some experience with doing door drops in the past, and a door drop, albeit cold, there's actually quite a lot of targeting you can do with a door drop. So we worked with a company who were able to help us to identify postcodes within Cambridgeshire that were both affluent and had a above average likelihood of being supporters of charities. So we ended up, for that first door drop, I think we mailed about 280,000 households around Cambridgeshire. We removed postcodes that were kind of a bit too close to other hospitals to kind of remove some of that competition element. And it was a kind of very traditional direct marketing pack, you know, all the usual elements that you might expect to receive from you know, a charity in one of these kind of printed packs. You know, we set ourselves some relatively modest targets because we were, you know, reasonably unsure. We knew there was quite a lot of propensity towards the hospital, so you know, we had a degree of confidence. But I mean, this goes back to something I was saying earlier about what can appear to be a very expensive activity on the face of it if you're not used to this type of activity. So I think that first door drop was approaching about £50,000 all told. The bulk of that cost was the media buying. Now what it did, we ended up with well over 2,000 responses, of which about 1,500 were brand new names to us. So new names onto the database. And unusually, it generated an enormous profit within the first year, something like £2.50 for every £1 we'd invested. Now, really, the key for us really was that new names in the database. That was our primary target. And then, you know, we very quickly followed those new names up by asking them to make another donation. So once on the database, we sent them a copy of our Christmas appeal, which conveniently wasn't long after we'd mailed this door drop pack. And to kind of demonstrate the value of those new responders, of those 1,500 people that were new to the database, 1,000 of them additionally gave to that Christmas appeal or the robot appeal, which is our next cash appeal that followed Christmas. So
yeah,
we'd very quickly converted more than 2/3 of them to a second gift.
Yeah, that's amazing.
I think now we're approaching about 70%. So really high conversion rates, a really good quality supporter. They're sort of self-identifying. I mean, they told us they respond to this type of activity already. So we were fairly confident that by putting a kind of cash DM pack in the post to them, they'd be reasonably responsive to it. But
it was certainly one of the most successful door drops we've seen in our decades of doing this stuff. And I think one of the things that we tried to do from this in building the creative was to really get some leverage on people's sense of gratitude towards the NHS and towards the doctors and nurses working in it. So, you know, this idea of them being heroes and giving everything, because essentially they're risking their lives at that point, and they still are, to save lives. And so just to quickly take you through the letter. So there's just a two-sided letter on the left here with a donation form at the bottom, if I can get to that. And we actually tested cash. No, this is the cash version. We tested it against regular giving, a direct to regular giving version, monthly giving.
A/B split test.
And both were profitable. I mean, this is almost unheard of for recruitment, but both were actually profitable in the first year. So it's incredible result. And so, as well as this, they obviously got the reply envelope there at the bottom right, and then at the top is the outer envelope. Very simple, black and white. And then in the middle there, that's a little postcard that we enclosed within the thing to enable people on the reverse to write just a message of support to people working at the hospital. And it was just the most fantastically successful thing, and continues. This is the really key bit, is that we've rolled it out, I think, at least three times since last year, and it continues to perform way above most other recruitment activities that we've seen.
Yeah, like I say, we've repeated it 3 times now. And the last time we did, we'd increased the volume to nearly 400,000 households. And, you know, bear in mind, they're in a sense, they're the same households we're mailing in that very first door drop, but nonetheless, it's still not only generating profit, but adding, you know, hundreds, maybe thousands of names. I think we've added something like 3,000 new names to the database as a result of those 3 door drops now. So really high. So just thinking about, you know, the lifetime value that I mentioned earlier, Sorry, I'm just waiting for something to load in front of me.
But while you're looking at that, I would say to people, I think what this does show is that the need for, if you have tested an activity, particularly on recruitment, and it's worked, then the really key thing is to roll it out. And it's just because it's done well in the test, that doesn't mean you've been successful as a fundraiser. You've only been successful when you've actually taken that, rolled it out, got more investment, and really started to bring supporters in because of that. That's where it really shows its value. And I think that's what we're always talking to ACT about. It's like, roll this out, come on, Paul, roll this out. And yeah, we're all, and you're always going back to the board to ask for more investment, and which is the way to do it, right?
Yeah, and it's great. And one of the nice things about that is because we're essentially using the same pack each time. We've made a couple of slight amendments to it, but the same pack. So, you know, we paid our creative costs all up front, but essentially the next two mailings, the only cost really were the media cost of, you know, actually getting Royal Mail to send those packs out for us. So it becomes, your cost per pack goes down the more you can sweat that asset and keep getting it out there. And particularly if you can demonstrate that it's still working. What's interesting is, you know, that although we kind of played on, you know, the emotion and need of the time, the actual ask in those door drop packs was an unrestricted general fund ask. You know, we made it quite clear on there that, you know, their donation will be used wherever the need was greatest. So what we've ended up with is actually a lot of really flexible income off the back of it, you know, just when it's needed the most.
It's great. It's a good example of how external recruitment can work. So we've got about, I think, 15 minutes of this conversation left. And I think what we should do, we were going to talk about donor development activities, and I think we should carry on with that because I think there's some interesting stuff about cash and legacy appeals. We were also going to talk about how ACT is built, and we've helped you build your regular giving program. I wonder if we might do that at another time, because that's a really important area to look at, and perhaps we could talk about that another time. So I hope that's okay with everybody. We might do that because I think we'd like to be able to talk a bit more about the donor development stuff now. So could we talk a little bit more then about the donor development side? So we've said, you know, it's really important to build a coherent and a sort of comprehensive supported development program. I think just to summarize the one that you've built, it is about the idea of getting people, as soon as somebody has come onto the database, whether it's as an inquirer or whether it's as a cash donor, that they are asked to give a regular gift very quickly early on, because that is the way that you actually get people on. That is the way that you get the best results, and they're most likely to give a regular gift as ongoing direct debit asks. As well as those ongoing direct debit asks when somebody just comes in, you also have an annual direct debit appeal. So to ask anybody who's not a current direct debit supporter to convert to direct debit. The great thing about those appeals is that you can also, because they're the same sort of ask as a direct debit upgrade, if that makes sense, you know, about giving long-term gifts and why that matters, you can actually do those at the same time. So you can mail cash givers with the conversion ask, and you can mail direct debit people with an upgrade ask. And so that gives you kind of economies of scale and makes use of the creative. I think that, to me, that sort of summarizes a very basic supporter journey in getting people onto DD. But you also have 3 or 4 cash appeals a year, plus an annual legacy appeal, a soulless legacy appeal. So I've just tried to summarize that there. I wonder if we could perhaps talk a little bit about the cash appeals and, you know, what you think makes a good cash appeal. And while you're doing that, I'll just show you an example.
Oh, blimey. Well, I think there's lots of things that make cash appeal, good cash appeal. Where to start? Where to start? So, I mean, you know, Richard's by far more of an expert on this than I kind of protest to be. But, you know, what's really important with the cash appeal is, you know, you've got to have a really strong theme, and you've got to, within that, you've got to answer some really key questions, which is, you know, why are you writing to that supporter at that time? Making it really clear what the problem is and what the solution is and what part they can play in that. You know, we deploy quite intentionally quite emotive language in the appeals. We want it to be quite clear that it's, you know, it's a real person. So we'll often have quite emotive cover letters or lift letters from, you know, genuine patients, and to kind of give an example of how emotive they might be, the Christmas appeal that we've just mailed, the lift letter is from somebody who very sadly lost their child, but felt their story was important enough to tell, to get others to help kind of be there for other parents. So But that bit being said, it's done in a very kind of empathetic and sensitive way. The kind of the copy is part of it. What we've found that's really helping us to kind of drive our results up is that we're becoming much more sophisticated in the way that we generate the data that we mail these appeals to. So over time, we've been gradually increasing the number of different segments that we'll break the data down into, so that each one of those segments, so we might have a Friends of Addenbrooke segment, we might have a legacy pledger segment, we might have a kind of low value cash giver segment. And the idea is that each of those segments, the appeal will speak to them and the type of support they've given before. So it feels like we're talking to them as an individual, you know, trying to give the impression of a one-to-one relationship rather than a kind of one-to-many relationship. And then we take that a step further by making sure that the asks that we ask for, the actual amounts of money, are weighted against what they've previously given to us. So they're familiar amounts of money, but we include within that a kind of upgrade formula as well. So we're always trying to nudge people's giving up. That's been incredibly valuable to us. So rather than asking everybody for a 15, 20 or £30 gift, those people that have got a history of giving quite large donations to us, their ask will be large. And we've found that's been really worthwhile. So, you know, yesterday, looking through the kind of income results for the current Christmas appeal, and we'd had, you know, 4 or 5 gifts of well over £1,000, one of which was £5,000. And that's because we asked that person for £5,000 because they've got a history of giving large gifts to us. So again, that was something quite kind of, yeah, challenging, and I think a few people felt quite uncomfortable when we were putting some of these amounts of money in. But again, it was based on the, you know, let's see what the data does, see how people behave, and then we'll adjust our approach in response to that.
Yeah. I think
there's loads to cover that makes a really good appeal, but I mean, some of the really basic elements there.
Yeah, no, that's really important. And I think certainly with hospital fundraising, it's about being quite bold in getting people to donate to the beneficiary. It's the beneficiaries that people care about. So it's about helping other people in need, and also helping staff and heroic doctors and nurses to do their jobs. And I think if you can focus it on that really helps to
absolutely. To do it. That's a really good point, which is that I think it's really easy sometimes to overlook that, you know, what people give to are people. So, you know, the hospital might come to us and say, we've got this really exciting widget that we really need in the hospital, this, you know, whizzy scanner. And it's very easy to put a appeal together that says, you know, help us buy this scanner. People don't care about the scanner. The scanner is just a means to an end. What people care about is the patient with cancer who's going to be treated, diagnosed faster because of the scanner. So it's the person that's going to get people giving, not the bit of kit. So what we sometimes find is that although we're raising money for a scanner or widget, actually we probably don't talk about it very much. What we talk about is the patient and the hero that's using that to save the patient.
Absolutely. I think that's a brilliant point. Yeah, that's a very good point. Okay, so I think what we might do is just have a quick look at legacy appeals very briefly, because I think this is a really fundamental thing for hospital fundraisers. And then we'll just have a look at some of just your broad conclusions, Paul, about what are some of the kind of key things about building an individual giving program at a hospital. So let me just have a quick look and try and share the screen for an example of a legacy appeal that ACT have done. And I think a good way to introduce this is to better say that for all charities, I think people are getting much more into realizing that legacy appeals are worth doing. You know, you have to actually ask for legacies to actually be able to get them. But I think there's something about the need to have a structured legacy program, one that's consistent and that you're asking regularly. So every year that you're building this narrative about why legacies matter. And the way that we've done it with ACT is to have basically an initial pack for legacies, which is kind of the fulfillment pack, the one that introduces them to everything, and that's mailed after they've been on the database for about a year or so, up to a year or so. And this includes a folder which kind of has a number of different materials in. So we're asking them directly if they would be interested in leaving a legacy. And the aim of the pack is really to kind of be aspirational, to say to people, well, what sort of legacy, not just financial, but as a human being do you want to leave? You know, how can you leave a mark on the world which is really kind and benevolent and something that you feel good about? And supporting your local hospital and the saving lives could be one of those things. And so that is what the pack aims to do. It aims to have different voices from different people. So you can see it as we go a bit below here. There are lift letters. There's somebody from Dr. Hugo Ford, who is a cancer clinician within the hospital. There's a lift letter from a patient. And it's just trying to make the arguments about why it's worthwhile to leave a legacy to the organisation. And enclosed within it is also a pledge form to say, well, either yes, I'm interested in doing that, or I'm not at the moment, but maybe send me more information. So there are 3 or 4 types of response we're looking for. And even a no at this point is actually useful for the charity, because it tells you, well, maybe not at the moment, but maybe in the future. And I think, again, charities are still quite behind on this thing about the need to send quite clear mailings about legacies, but it really does pay off. And I think, Paul, I mean, it's worked for ACT, hasn't it, this approach?
Yeah, absolutely. So this kind of forms the kind of foundation piece for all of our legacy marketing activities. So we do a range of activities that promote legacies across, bus stop ads, radio, social media, newsletters, and so on and so forth. But this is the really key one, because it's the one where we're very upfront, and we put a pat right under the nose of the people that are already supporting us to say, will you consider kind of leaving a gift in a will to kind of have the greatest possible impact on the hospital? So it's really valuable for us. I think, we were averaging, 1 or 2 pledges a year, and then we started these mailings, and, we're now getting 60, 70 pledges and inquiries and expressions of interest each year, and I appreciate this is about long-term sustainable income. So you're not going to get this income within 12 months, almost certainly not. But what it does is give you income, between 5 and 20 years in the future. So, and it's cumulative. So every time you do this, theoretically, by the time we get to 5 or 6 years down the road, each of the previous appeals are going to start to be generating an impact on the hospital. And I think, Richard, you mentioned it's really important to actually ask people for legacies if you want legacies. But the other thing that we've found as well is that by being very upfront and asking people for legacies and telling them how they can leave a gift in their will, what we're finding is that people are leaving gifts now that have significantly fewer or no restrictions attached to them. Whereas what we found in the past, because people were self-motivated to leave a gift because they'd had brilliant treatment, they tend to restrict that gift to the clinician or department where they'd had brilliant treatment or care. Whereas now, because we're driving that, we're taking the action on driving that legacy giving, people are trusting us and saying, use the gift wherever the need is greatest, up to you. We trust what you're going to do with it. We know you'll make a difference. And trust really sits at the kind of basis of everything we do. Every donation is an act of trust. The greater the commitment, the greater the act of trust, and arguably no bigger act of trust than leaving a gift in your will. So so much of the program essentially is about building trust to increase the chance somebody's going to leave a gift in their will. That's the kind of nub of it. We get people onto direct debits and we get them giving cash bills, and we report back to them and we send them newsletters and we say thank you, all with the ultimate intention of getting to the top of the donor pyramid where they'll leave a gift in their will. And
it's absolutely right, and legacies feel like they should be the foundation stone for most hospital charities, because it's
absolutely. And the research at the moment from Remember a Charity and Legacy Foresight is that hospital charities and certainly healthcare charities are the fastest growing legacy market at the moment. So it's an opportunity worth kind of jumping on while it's still an opportunity, if that makes sense. And legacies it's a competitive world, because lots of the wider charity sector have already realised that the money's in legacies, and that money is predominantly within the baby boomer generation. So it's not to sound too kind of arbitrary about it, but it's a time limited opportunity, should we say.
Okay, so I mean, as I say, we were going to talk about the regular giving scheme that we've built with ACT, but I think if Paul if you might be up for it another time, perhaps coming and talking about it another time, that would be amazing, because I think that's worth a session in itself, really. I mean, before we sort of close the recording and this bit, and we ask anybody for their questions, I wonder if you could just summarise for me. Do you have a sense of any sort of additional advice you'd have for any charities that are perhaps starting from scratch on trying to build an individual giving program at a hospital? I would say my first bit of advice would be do it. you know, do it, because the potential is so great. And it's actually, I think it's greater for hospital charities than for other charities, because you've got this audience that are there and are close to you. So do it, try to build a plan, try to get your trustees on board to investigate and to understand what the long-term benefits of this are, and then bring them on the journey with you to trust you in the methods that you're using. I wonder if there's anything that you'd add to that, Paul.
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right, Richard. I mean, having come from an international environmental conservation charity where, you know, our supporters might be predominantly UK based, but our work was thousands of miles away. So, you know, you're trying to create a kind of emotional connection between, you know, them living their comfortable lifestyles in the UK and kind of desperate situations in far-flung countries that none of them can really appreciate. Whereas the gift with hospital charities is that the people we're talking to, you know, them and their families have directly experienced the cause that we're trying to raise money for. So it just makes that relationship so much simpler, so much more kind of tangible. So it is a bit of a gift. And I think, you know, there's an awful lot of low-hanging fruit existing for hospital charities at the moment. Is, you know, one of the things that kind of I often think back on, you know, in terms of getting the buy-in for a program like this. So there was one particular appeal that we wanted to launch at the very beginning of the pandemic. We wanted to do a very kind of simple emergency appeal. And we put together what was a very brilliant pack. And the hospital said, no, we don't feel comfortable with this. It feels really uncomfortable to be asking people for money at a time when there's crisis and people are worried and lives might be lost. We don't want to put our names to this. Luckily, as a charity, we were brave enough to say, okay, fine, we'll send this out with our name on it, and we'll be brave, and we'll take the risk, and we'll accept whatever happens in return. What happened was people didn't complain that they'd received a letter from a hospital charity asking them for money. We had literally hundreds of people saying to us, thank you so much for telling me how I can play my part, how I can make a difference. And even to this day, the conversations we have now with senior management and staff within the hospital have changed because of that moment. And it really has. It's transformational, because it really demonstrated that the way that they were viewing the activity and reading the copy and understanding the nuance was entirely different to the way that the public were interpreting it. They just wanted to make a difference and they didn't know how. We were giving them the opportunity to do that. And I think it really, even outside the pandemic, it highlighted the opportunity that people want to be there. They want to make a difference. Sometimes it just takes us, like Richard says, just doing it, just, you know, stepping over the edge as such. I do, you know, on a kind of more practical level, I do think one of the most important things you can do is, you know, write a plan, you know, write a strategy, hold yourself to that strategy of, you know, these are the activities we're going to deliver. This is the intention for the program. You know, and this is how we're going to kind of evaluate its effectiveness.